the beginning of Sanctuary, A Witch's Tale Episode 1, we were shown that Sarah, Penn, Abigail, Bridget, and others were telling Julia and her husband Albie about how safe their town was and how people had wrong perceptions about it. Sanctuary was a place where witches didn't have to hide to practice their witchcraft. They lived together with the non-magical people, if one can call them that, and everybody was used to having them around. In fact, proper certification was provided to witches, and only the registered ones could practice their craft. Sanctuary was indeed a beautiful place, but for Julia at that point in time, it was all very new. Albie was very open about the kinds of perceptions people had about Sanctuary outside. He said that people thought that witches had these weird beliefs, and that they were sort of evil beings who could curse a person if anyone went against them. Sarah laughed, and she didn't mind it because she was already well aware of all those things. Sarah came from a family of witches, and her family had been there for more than 300 years. She assured the couple that once they moved into the neighborhood, they would understand how wrong each of those perceptions was and how the witches were nothing like that. Just then, something untoward happened. Though we were not clearly shown, it felt like a body had fallen from the roof. Sarah immediately cut her hand and probably dropped her blood on the body. In the next scene, the narrative took us 6 years ahead of time, but we got a sense that some miracle had happened that day. Abigail held Sarah in really high regard, and we saw that she recommended people to go and consult Sarah in case they were having any sort of emotional or physical problem. One time, a girl named Emily came to Sarah, and we got to know how her powers worked and what ethical limitations she put on the craft. Emily probably had a miscarriage, and she was pregnant for the second time, which was why she was very scared. She wanted to have a baby, and she asked Sarah if she had some spell or potion that could help her give birth to a healthy baby without any complications. Sarah told Emily that though she couldn't interfere in matters of birth and death and other biological aspects, she could definitely give her a potion that could give her the fortitude to bear the pain. Sarah Penn had a really soothing impact on the people, and it was evident how relieved Emily felt after talking to her. It felt like Sarah was really good at what she did, and people really respected her because of that. It was a known fact that Harper, Sarah's daughter, was obsessed with Dan, but he didn't respect her emotions at all. He made fun of her behind her back, and every student knew about that. Dan was Abigail's son, and he had an extremely bright future ahead of him. He was a brilliant sportsman and an extremely popular guy at his school. During the charity event that Abigail had organized, we saw how much pride she took in her son's achievement. The teenagers had organized a party, and everybody was very excited to be there. We got to know that even Beatrice, Julia's daughter, liked Dan, and considering that she too was quite popular in her school, Dan reciprocated her feelings. In Sanctuary, A Witch's Tale Episode 1, we saw that Harper approached Dan at the party, but he very rudely asked her to not ruin the night for him. He went from there, and the next thing we knew was that the entire building where the party was being held caught fire, and Dan fell from the building and died on the spot. Abigail was distraught, and she knew that she would never be able to move on from that loss. Her son had a bright future. Everything was going in his favor, and just like that, everything got destroyed. There were rumors that a sex tape had been played during the party, after which the accident had happened. There were also rumors that it was not an accident and that Dan committed suicide. The parents, the people living in the neighborhood, everybody wanted some sort of closure, and that was when DCI Maggie Knight was called to take charge of matters. Harper was not exactly on the best of terms with her mother. Sarah wanted Harper to practice witchcraft like her and help the community, but she didn't inherit the powers. It happened all the time in magic families that all kids born to witches didn't have magical powers in them. Harper had grown to despise the entire business, and she didn't hesitate to refer to witches as abominations. Harper was in the hospital after the accident, and she told her mother that she wanted some alone time to process whatever had happened. We got to know that the sex tape that was played during the party was of Dan and Harper. They had a fight after that, and soon Dan jumped from the upper floor. DCI Knight went to interrogate Beatrice, and though she said that she didn't know anything about the incident since she didn't see it happening, it felt like she was hiding something, and moreover, her parents were trying to save her. Beatrice told DCI Knight that she should go and interrogate Jack, as he probably knew something since he was always with Dan. Towards the end of Sanctuary, A Witch's Tale Episode 1, DC Ryan Henshaw came and told Maggie Knight that a witness had come forward and claimed that Dan's death was not an accident, not a suicide, but a pre-planned murder. The episode left us on this cliffhanger, not revealing who could be behind it. As of now, anybody could have a motive to kill Dan, and DCI Knight, with time, would surely unravel the mystery and bring the truth to light. Out of the blue, Jack decides to come forward as a witness, accusing Harper of murder. His evidence is in the form of a video where she's swiftly moving her hands around in anger on the stairs while Dan is on the landing. Jack claims she killed him through witchcraft, but the whole town knows Harper doesn't have powers. Seeing Maggie's reaction to his story, Jack isn't quite satisfied, so he chooses to tell Abigail about his theory to instigate her against Harper and Sarah. Grief-stricken Abigail is easily swayed because of her vulnerable mental space. She actually sees some truth in Jake's words, even if she dismisses them completely at first. It turns out that during Harper's test for witchcraft, only Sarah and the Muta priest-like fellow for witches were present as witnesses. Sarah feels as if Harper always knew that she didn't have the power, which is why she insisted on having no friends around during her test. On the other hand, while Maggie is going around asking people about Dan and Harper, she remembers that she's been in Sanctuary before. The last time she was there was a call about a boy falling down and hurting himself, but when she reached the house, he was completely fine. 6 years ago, it was Dan who fell down, which could possibly have been a suicide attempt, and Sarah saved him by performing a miracle. This is why when Maggie arrived at the scene, he was completely fine. We can imagine that this is also why the ladies all have so much trust in Sarah, because they were all present with her during this situation. Maggie doesn't see any obvious connections between the old situation and the present one, but I can't help but see the similarity in the way things have turned out. Is it possible that Dan didn't want to be saved? In the meantime, Beatrice accuses her dad of berating Dan before the party, but he denies it. Although he does mention wanting to wring his neck himself for the way he treated Beatrice. It turns out that capital punishment for witches is still a thing if magic is involved in murder. If Harper is found guilty, Sarah won't be able to do anything to save her. After some deliberation, Sarah decides to perform a spell that will reveal what happened to Dan at the party. A difficult spell that may not always work. Sarah puts in all her effort to try it out. The bowl she's using for the potion explodes, and she's left more confused with no answers. Before the explosion, her ears were ringing, almost making it look like someone might have been interfering. In the meantime, at the school, Maggie calls out Jack for trying to get with Dan romantically, but being rejected. This makes him look suspicious too, and because he may simply be jealous of Harper, he could have blamed her. Elsewhere, Abigail tries to convince the other two women to take her side, but the women are adamant that Sarah would never do anything to hurt them. So instead of fighting against her, they should be looking to her for answers. The team decides to get a magic investigator on board. At the end of the episode, Abigail asks Sarah to bring Dan back to her because she has no purpose in life without him. If she can't do that, then Harper will be taken to court, and Jack will testify against her. In the preview, we see that there's a book of black magic involved in this whole situation. Who is the secret witch of the town who wants to get Sarah in trouble? Does it have anything to do with Sarah not getting consent from Dan all those years ago before saving him? We'll find out in next episode of Sanctuary, A Witch's Tale.